The year 2025 will be remembered as the year the rains came and refused to leave. It began not with a single dramatic storm, but with a relentless persistence. The skies over much of Asia opened up, and the water fell in thick, unrelenting sheets. Meteorologists watched their screens in disbelief as rainfall records were not just broken, but utterly shattered within hours. In Pakistan, the monsoon season arrived with a fury that felt biblical. What should have been life-giving rains for the crops became a terrifying, destructive force. The ground, already saturated from previous weeks of damp weather, could not absorb another drop. Small streams and gentle rivers, the lifelines of countless communities, began to swell with a menacing speed, their character changing from placid to predatory in the space of a single afternoon. This was not a normal flood, it was a transformation of the landscape itself. The line between river and land simply vanished. In the Punjab province, the water rose so fast that it seemed to climb the walls of homes. Farmers who had spent their lives reading the sky and the seasons were caught completely off guard by the sheer volume and velocity of the deluge. They watched as the water crept across their fields, then poured into their courtyards, and finally breached their doorsteps. The familiar world was being erased, replaced by a vast, churning expanse of brown water. The sound of the rain was a constant drumming, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else, a soundtrack to the unfolding catastrophe that was swallowing whole provinces. The initial hours were a blur of confusion and desperate activity. People scrambled to save what they could. They moved livestock to higher ground, they piled sandbags with frantic energy, and they tried to secure their most precious belongings. But the water was too fast, too powerful. It was a liquid monster, indiscriminate in its consumption. It devoured fields of cotton and wheat, the foundations of the local economy. It flowed over roads, cutting off escape routes and turning villages into isolated, helpless islands. The rising tide was a clock ticking down, and for many, time was rapidly running out as the water continued its inexorable climb, turning homes into watery traps. The scale of the disaster became terrifyingly clear as the first day turned into night. Darkness fell, but the rain did not stop. In the Swat district of Pakistan, a region famed for its scenic beauty, the Swat River became an unstoppable torrent. It tore through valleys, carrying with it trees, boulders, and the debris of shattered lives. The power of the water was immense, a raw force of nature unleashed. The sound of the river was no longer a gentle murmur, but a thunderous roar of destruction. It was a sound that would haunt the survivors for years to come, a reminder of the moment their world was torn apart by the very element that once sustained it. In the countless villages scattered across Pakistan's agricultural heartlands, life came to a standstill, then disintegrated. The floodwaters did not just pass through, they settled, turning fertile plains into enormous stagnant lakes that stretched to the horizon. Mud brick homes, the product of generations of family labor, simply dissolved into the murky water. Families who had lived on the same plot of land for centuries found themselves homeless in an instant, with nothing left but the clothes on their backs and a profound sense of disbelief. The water took everything: furniture, cooking pots, school books, and treasured family photographs. It washed away the past and drowned the future. The loss was more than just physical. The floods destroyed the very fabric of rural life. Schools, often simple 1- or 2-room buildings, were inundated, their desks and blackboards floating in the muddy water. A UNESCO assessment would later survey 120 girls' primary schools in the hard-hit Swat district and find a scene of utter devastation. Nearly half of the schools had their roofs damaged, and a third had their boundary walls collapse, leaving the spaces unsafe and exposed. For over 12,000 young female students in that district alone, the path to education was abruptly cut off. The places that represented hope and opportunity were now ruined shells, filled with silt and despair. Survival became a desperate, hour-by-hour struggle. As the waters rose, people climbed onto the roofs of their submerged homes, hoping for rescue. They huddled together, exposed to the relentless rain, watching as their worldly possessions were swept away. The cries for help were often lost in the roar of the water. Farm animals, crucial to a family's livelihood, were lost in the deluge, their bodies seen floating in the currents. People shared what little food they had, trying to keep spirits up as they waited. The sense of isolation was absolute. With roads gone and communication lines down, each small community was an island of suffering cut off from the outside world. When rescue finally came, it was often in the form of a small boat or a military helicopter. The evacuations were scenes of chaos and heartbreak. People had to make impossible choices, leaving behind everything they had ever known. Over 500,000 people were evacuated in the Punjab province alone, a mass exodus driven by the rising tide. They were taken to makeshift camps, crowded into tents or the few remaining public buildings left standing. They were safe from the water, but they were now refugees in their own country, facing a future filled with uncertainty. The fields they once farmed were gone, their homes were destroyed, and their communities were shattered. The Great Flood of 2025 was not just a rural disaster, it brought modern cities to their knees. In sprawling metropolises like Chongqing in China, the urban landscape itself became a weapon. The city's steep streets, usually bustling with traffic, were transformed into furious, fast-flowing rivers. The water channeled through these concrete canyons with incredible force, sweeping away cars, buses, and anything else in its path. Underground metro systems, the pride of urban engineering, flooded with shocking speed, becoming dark, watery tombs for those trapped inside. The systems designed to move people efficiently became death traps, overwhelmed by a force they were never built to withstand. The infrastructure of modern life, which we so often take for granted, crumbled systematically. In Pakistan and elsewhere, massive concrete bridges, symbols of connectivity and progress, were no match for the flood's power. The relentless currents scoured away their foundations until the structures groaned and collapsed into the churning water below. Their destruction severed vital links, isolating entire districts and making it nearly impossible for rescue teams to reach the afflicted. The storm drains in cities, meant to manage excess water, instead geysered, shooting plumes of water back up onto the streets. The systems designed to protect the cities were now actively contributing to their drowning. Another critical failure was the collapse of communication and power grids. As the floodwaters rose, they inundated electrical substations, plunging vast urban areas into a sudden and disorienting darkness. Without electricity, life ground to a halt. But even more terrifying was the loss of communication. Cell towers were toppled by the force of the water, or simply lost power, severing the connection between trapped residents and the outside world. People could not call for help. They could not find out if their loved ones were safe. They were left in a silent, dark, and watery world, enveloped by a profound sense of isolation and fear. The flood erased the very distinction between the built environment and the natural world. Rivers swelled to unimaginable sizes. The Ditang River in Punu County, China, rose by an astonishing 19 meters, a vertical increase that is difficult to comprehend. It was as if the sea had risen up to claim the land. The neat lines of streets, parks, and buildings dissolved into a single chaotic waterscape. For the millions of people living in these urban centers, it was a terrifying realization. The concrete and steel of their cities offered no real protection against the overwhelming power of a changing climate. The modern world, it turned out, was far more fragile than anyone had imagined. The devastation in Pakistan was not an isolated event. In 2025, the planet's climate system unleashed its fury across the globe, with Asia bearing a particularly heavy burden. In November of that year, Vietnam was battered by a succession of powerful typhoons, Haifa, Bualoy, and Matmo. These storms brought not only ferocious winds, but also torrential rains that triggered widespread and catastrophic flooding. The impact was immediate and heartbreaking. Hundreds of people were killed or injured, and hundreds of thousands of homes were damaged or completely destroyed, leaving a trail of ruin across the country. The scale of the disaster was immense, affecting communities from the mountains to the coast. The storms in Vietnam also struck at the heart of the nation's future and its past. Nearly 10,000 schools across the country were damaged, disrupting the education of countless children, especially in vulnerable ethnic minority communities. At the same time, the floods and storm surges battered Vietnam's precious cultural heritage. The ancient city of Hoi An and the historic complex of Hue, both designated as World Heritage Sites, sustained significant damage. These places, which had stood for centuries as testaments to the nation's history and identity, were now threatened by the rising waters, their timeless structures inundated and eroded by the force of the deluge. The pattern of destruction repeated itself across the region. In Indonesia, severe floods in December 2025 claimed the lives of at least 961 people in Aceh and Sumatra. The disaster there was made significantly worse by years of illegal logging and deforestation, which had stripped the hillsides of the trees that once helped absorb heavy rainfall. As a result, the water cascaded down with nothing to slow it, sweeping away more than 20 entire villages in its path. In neighboring Thailand, floods in the same month killed at least 276 people across 14 provinces. From Sri Lanka to Nepal and India, the story was the same: record-breaking rains, overwhelmed rivers, and communities engulfed by disaster. Even nations far from the Asian monsoon felt the impact. The United States experienced its own series of devastating floods. In July 2025, flash floods in Texas killed over 100 people when the Guadalupe River swelled to a record 9 meters, tragically sweeping away a summer camp and claiming the lives of 25 girls and their counselors. Between January and September of that year, the United States recorded over 7,000 separate flood events, resulting in 242 deaths. The events of 2025 were a clear and terrifying signal that this was a global crisis, a synchronized assault of extreme weather that respected no borders and spared no continent. The catastrophic floods of 2025 were not simply a case of bad weather. They were the result of a perfect storm, a deadly combination of extreme meteorological events supercharged by a changing climate and compounded by human actions on the ground. Experts are clear. The primary driver was the intensification of the planet's water cycle. A warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, which means that when it does rain, it rains harder. This led to the record-breaking downpours and the unusually intense monsoon season in Pakistan. The late-season cyclones that struck Viet Nam were another symptom of this new, more volatile climate reality, bringing devastation at a time of year when communities expected respite. However, climate change only set the stage. The tragedy was magnified by how we have reshaped the world around us. Decades of urbanization have seen cities expand rapidly, often paving over natural floodplains that once acted as sponges, soaking up excess water. We have built homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure in harm's way, encroaching on the very spaces that rivers need to swell safely. In Indonesia, the link between deforestation and the flood severity was undeniable. The removal of forests for logging and agriculture left the land bare and unable to absorb the deluge, turning rainfall into destructive runoff that carried away soil, homes, and lives. The infrastructure designed to protect us also failed. Many of the world's flood control systems, from dams and levees to urban storm drains, were designed based on historical weather patterns from the 20th century. They were simply not built to handle the new normal of 21st century climate extremes. They were obsolete before the water even started to rise. When the deluge of 2025 arrived, these systems were overwhelmed, and in some cases, they failed catastrophically. Levees were breached, dams overflowed, and drains backed up, proving that our old methods of fighting floods are no longer sufficient for the challenges we now face. This convergence of factors, a supercharged climate, ill-advised land use, and inadequate infrastructure, created a recipe for disaster on a global scale. The floods were not just a natural disaster, they were a human-made one. They revealed the profound vulnerabilities we have built into our societies. The events of that year served as a brutal lesson, demonstrating that our attempts to control nature have often been short-sighted. We have built a world that is incredibly fragile in the face of the very forces we have helped to unleash, and in 2025, we paid a heavy price for that fragility. Beyond the staggering statistics of destroyed homes and collapsed bridges lies the immense human toll of the 2025 floods. For those caught in the disaster, the experience was one of terror, loss, and a desperate fight for survival. Imagine huddling on a rooftop with your family, the water rising steadily around you, listening to the horrifying sounds of your neighborhood being torn apart. The feeling was one of utter helplessness, of being at the mercy of an unforgiving force. Survivors spoke of the constant fear Fear of the water rising higher, fear for missing loved ones, and fear of what the future would hold when the water finally receded. The psychological scars run deep. In the aftermath, communities were enveloped in a collective trauma. In Pakistan's Swat district, a UNESCO assessment found that an alarming 93% of the surveyed girls' schools had no system in place to provide psychosocial support to students. These children had witnessed terrifying events, lost their homes, and seen their sense of security shattered. They were left to cope with anxiety, grief, and fear with little to no professional help. The disaster did not end when the rain stopped. For many, the mental and emotional struggle was just beginning, a silent crisis unfolding in the wake of the physical destruction. Acts of incredible bravery and resilience shone through the darkness. Neighbors helped neighbors, sharing food, water, and shelter. People used makeshift rafts to rescue those who were stranded, risking their own lives to pull others from the rising water. In Pakistan, local parent-teacher councils, even amidst their own losses, quickly began to prioritize what was needed to get children back to school. They identified the most urgent repairs, fixing roofs, rebuilding toilets, and securing boundary walls. Because they understood that restoring a sense of normalcy and safety for their children was a critical step towards healing the entire community. Yet survival came at a cost. The loss of homes and livelihoods plunged millions into poverty. Farmers who had lost their land and livestock had no way to earn an income. Families were displaced to crowded, unsanitary camps where the risk of disease was high. For many, the floods represented not just a temporary setback, but the complete erasure of their economic stability. The disaster took a disproportionate toll on the most vulnerable, especially women and children, who faced increased risks to their safety and well-being in the chaotic aftermath. The human cost was not just measured in lives lost, but in futures derailed and communities left struggling to piece themselves back together. As the full, horrifying scale of the 2025 global floods became clear, the international community began to mobilize. The sheer number of countries affected simultaneously stretched humanitarian resources to their limit, but organizations worked to deliver aid to the hardest-hit regions. The response was not just about immediate relief, it was also about long-term recovery and building resilience. On January 23, 2026, UNESCO announced a significant package of emergency support for Viet Nam, securing around $740,000. This funding was specifically targeted at two critical areas: safeguarding damaged cultural heritage sites and helping to restore the education system. In Vietnam, the focus was on both the past and the future. UNESCO dispatched teams to conduct technical assessments at the World Heritage Sites of Hue and Hoi An, developing plans to safeguard these invaluable cultural treasures from further damage. At the same time, the organization worked to get children back into the classroom. In the provinces of Cao Bang and Lang Son, support was directed towards rehabilitating learning spaces, replacing destroyed equipment, and crucially addressing the psychosocial needs of students and teachers who had endured the trauma of the disaster. The goal was to create safe and supportive environments where learning could resume. A similar, targeted approach was taken in Pakistan. Following the detailed assessment of damage to girls' schools in the Swat district, UNESCO and its partners began working with local communities to rebuild. The focus was on building back better. This meant not just repairing the damaged buildings, but constructing schools with more resilient designs that could better withstand future floods. The international support aimed to empower local communities, ensuring that parents felt confident in the safety of the schools before sending their daughters back, a vital step in preventing a long-term disruption to girls' education in the region. The global response also included a significant investment in science and planning. With funding from partners like Japan, UNESCO initiated projects in Vietnam to advance science-based disaster risk reduction. This included bolstering early warning systems to provide communities with more time to prepare and evacuate. It also involved developing new strategies and training for creating safer learning environments. The international response to the 2025 floods was therefore twofold, providing immediate, life-saving aid while also investing in the knowledge and infrastructure needed to reduce the impact of the inevitable floods of the future. The Great Global Flood of 2025 was a brutal but necessary wake-up call. It taught us that our old relationship with water is no longer sustainable in an era of climate change. The key lesson, according to many experts, is that we must shift our strategy from fighting floods to living with them. This means we can no longer rely solely on building higher walls and stronger levees. Instead, we must begin to give rivers more room to breathe. This involves restoring natural floodplains, protecting wetlands, and rethinking development in high-risk areas, allowing these ecosystems to act as natural buffers that absorb and slow floodwaters. We must also fundamentally rethink our infrastructure. The cities, bridges, and power grids that failed so spectacularly in 2025 were designed for a climate that no longer exists. Future construction must be resilient by design, anticipating more extreme weather events. This could mean elevating critical buildings, designing sponge cities with permeable surfaces that absorb rainfall, and building bridges with deeper, more robust foundations. It requires a move away from rigid gray infrastructure towards more flexible, green solutions that work with nature rather than against it. This is not just an engineering challenge, it is a paradigm shift in how we plan and build our communities. Strengthening our warning and response systems is another critical lesson. While the rains of 2025 were extreme, better early warning systems could have saved more lives. Investing in advanced weather forecasting, robust communication networks that function during a crisis, and clear community-focused evacuation plans is essential. In Pakistan, the call to establish psychosocial support and protection mechanisms in schools highlights another vital area. Our disaster response must care for the mental and emotional well-being of survivors, not just their physical needs. A truly resilient society is one that can help its people heal as well as rebuild. Ultimately, the hope that emerges from the wreckage of 2025 is that we have learned our lesson. The floodwaters washed away the illusion that we were safe from the consequences of a warming planet. They showed us our vulnerabilities with devastating clarity. The path forward requires courage, investment, and a new kind of humility, an acceptance that we must adapt to a more volatile world. The memory of the drowned villages, the submerged cities, and the countless lives upended must fuel a global commitment to prepare, adapt, and build a safer, more resilient future for the generations to come. The water will rise again. Whether we are ready for it is up to us.